Welcome to Emavira Audiobooks. Tonight's story is The Ninth Will, an Australian inheritance mystery. A tale of a lonely photograph in a post office box, a genealogist with a beautiful and terrible method, and an 82-year-old woman who decides that the safest thing to do with her own vulnerability is to use it as bait. Pour something warm. Get comfortable. Let's begin. Margaret Fane was 82 years old, one of South Australia's most respected private art collectors, and had spent the better part of 6 decades building a life so thoroughly self-sufficient that she rarely thought of herself as lonely. That quiet self-assessment made the photograph that arrived in her Adelaide Hills post office box on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday all the more disorienting. It showed a man she didn't recognize, dressed in the fashion of the 1950s, standing outside a modest weatherboard house with 2 small children beside him. There was no note, no return address, nothing beyond a single typed line tucked into the envelope. Your father had another family. Ask him what happened to the Renshaws. Margaret's father, Desmond Fane, a formidable pastoralist turned property developer, had died 11 years earlier, prosperous, and by every account she'd ever heard, entirely without secrets. And yet something in the stranger's face, in the set of his jaw, struck her as uncomfortably, unaccountably familiar. She kept the photograph propped against her auction catalogs for days, turning it over in her hands in the quiet of her hillside home, surrounded by the considerable collection she'd spent a lifetime assembling and had always assumed would pass, without much fuss, to a scattering of cousins she barely knew. She mentioned it to almost no one at first. Her closest professional friend, an auction house specialist named Bartholomew Reyes who had known her for 20 years, would later recall the phone call she made that week, ostensibly about an unrelated valuation. I could tell within minutes that something had unsettled her, he said. Margaret Fane does not get unsettled easily. I'd never once heard that particular note in her voice. Not fear exactly, more like she'd been handed a question she genuinely didn't know how to answer about her own life. Even the postal clerk who'd handled Margaret's mail for 11 years, a careful woman named Dolores Comu, remembered the envelope as faintly unusual, hand-addressed, no return marking, though at the time it struck her as nothing worse than an eager fan letter. It would be many months and a great deal of investigative effort before anyone traced that envelope back to a small regional post office in Tasmania, one of several such offices a man named Bernard Voss had quietly used over the years for exactly this kind of correspondence. It was Margaret's barrister, Zoe Kallis, who first suggested the name of a private genealogist several of her other elderly clients had used to good effect, a discreet, highly recommended researcher named Julian Cross. He's expensive, Zoe warned, and he's thorough. If there's a Renshaw family connected to your father, Julian will find them, documented beyond any reasonable doubt. Margaret, who had built her considerable success on precisely this kind of careful, evidence-based decision-making, found the recommendation immediately appealing and arranged to meet him the following week, entirely unaware that she was about to become the 9th client in a pattern that had already, quietly and invisibly, claimed 8 lives across the country. She drove into Adelaide that morning telling herself she was simply pursuing an interesting historical curiosity, unable to fully name, even to herself, the deeper hope stirring beneath that careful, practical framing. Julian Cross had spent 9 careful years building his genealogy consultancy, cultivating a client base of exactly the kind of person his method worked on with such reliability: wealthy, elderly, and functionally isolated Australians, with substantial estates, no close surviving family, and a private, unspoken ache for the belonging their money had never quite bought them. His method always began with genuine, meticulous research, real archives, real historical records, a professional thoroughness that would withstand any ordinary scrutiny a suspicious solicitor might apply. Only in the final stage, once a plausible distant family narrative had been constructed from authentic historical fragments, did Julian introduce the element that made his consultancy so extraordinarily profitable: a carefully selected, carefully coached individual, presented as the client's newly discovered relative, whose warmth, gratitude, and apparent disinterest in the client's wealth made them, invariably, irresistible. "People don't leave their money to strangers," he told his one trusted associate, a quiet, capable woman named Rinaldis, who handled the coaching process with a psychological precision Julian privately considered superior to his own. "They leave it to family. My entire business is manufacturing family, convincingly enough that the manufacturing itself becomes invisible." He met Margaret in his discreet Adelaide office and recognized, within minutes of their conversation, exactly the profile 9 years had taught him to identify with near-perfect accuracy: intelligent, guarded, and profoundly, quietly hungry for a connection her considerable achievements had never fully satisfied. He offered her tea, listened more than he spoke, and allowed the silences between her sentences to stretch just long enough that she found herself filling them with far more of her private history than she had originally intended to share. "I'll need time," he told her, examining the photograph with practiced, convincing care. "Genuine genealogy takes patience, Mrs. Fane. I won't manufacture you an answer simply to please you quickly. I'll find you the truth, whatever it turns out to be." Margaret felt her guardedness soften by a degree she would later find difficult to fully explain, precisely the reaction Julian Cross had spent 9 years learning to produce, with surgical reliability. Rinaldis, who would eventually help investigators understand exactly how this machine operated from the inside, described the work in terms that made its quiet menace all the more chilling for how ordinary it sounded. "I coached people to be convincing," she told Aaron Wu, in the extended interview that followed her arrest, long after Margaret's case had run its course. "I taught them what to say, how to hold themselves, when to express gratitude, and when to hold back. I want to be honest, I was very good at it, and I found the work genuinely interesting, in the way any skilled craft is interesting to someone who's good at it. I told myself, for years, that I was simply helping lonely elderly people find companionship and family connection they were unlikely to otherwise experience. I did not allow myself to think carefully about what happened to each client roughly a year after their will was altered, because thinking carefully about it would have required me to stop, and I had built an entire professional identity by that point around a skill I wasn't sure I could simply set aside. It was a portrait, psychologists would later observe, of a very particular and very human kind of complicity, genuine skill, and genuine self-deception, operating in careful, sustained parallel across nearly a decade. Margaret's considerable art collection, assembled across 6 decades and including several significant works by prominent Australian painters, had always represented for her something closer to a private conversation with history than a simple financial asset. "I've spent 60 years choosing each piece because it spoke to something specific in me," she told Zoe, walking her through the Hillside Homes gallery spaces in one of their early consultations, "not because of its market value, though I'm well aware most of it has become extremely valuable regardless of my intentions. I always assumed it would go to a public institution eventually, perhaps with some pieces to my cousins. The idea of a genuine blood relative, someone who might actually understand why I chose each of these pieces rather than simply inheriting their value, was more appealing to me than I think I fully admitted to myself. This specific vulnerability, not simple loneliness, but a very particular desire for someone who might understand and continue her life's curatorial project, was exactly the kind of individually tailored profile Julian Cross's method depended on identifying and exploiting with devastating precision. It is worth pausing, before the story moves forward, to understand exactly what kind of man Margaret had just invited into her life. Julian Cross's own background, examined much later during the trial's evidentiary phase, revealed a childhood considerably more privileged and stable than the desperate circumstances that shaped some of his co-conspirators, a detail the prosecution's forensic psychologist, Dr. Callum Ashworth, found significant precisely because it complicated any easy explanation for what Julian had become. There is no clear developmental wound in Mr. Cross's history of the kind we sometimes identify in offenders of this type, Dr. Ashworth would testify. He was raised in comfortable circumstances, well-educated, showed early and considerable talent in historical research that a functioning, ethical person could easily have built into an entirely legitimate and rewarding career. What we observe instead is a specific and troubling absence of ordinary empathic constraint that's simply found in genealogical fraud, a uniquely effective outlet for talents that might otherwise have been directed toward entirely legitimate historical research. Whatever quiet catastrophe was unfolding in Margaret's Adelaide Hills post office box, in other words, had not been set in motion by damage or desperation. It had been set in motion by choice, by a man who had looked at his own considerable gifts and decided, coolly and deliberately, exactly what he wanted to use them for. 6 weeks into his research, Julian introduced Margaret to Thomas Renshaw, a warm, unassuming man in his early 40s who ran a small vineyard in the Barossa Valley and who greeted the news of their possible connection with what appeared to be genuine, moved astonishment. "I always knew there was a gap somewhere in my grandfather's story," he told Margaret over their first lunch, arranged by Julian at a quiet Adelaide restaurant. He never talked about his childhood. "My own father used to say there was something painful buried back there Grandpa Renshaw simply refused to discuss." Thomas asked Margaret nothing about her wealth or her estate across their entire 2-hour conversation, focusing instead on genuine, curious questions about her life and her father, a restraint Margaret found, precisely as Julian's method relied upon it doing, considerably more compelling than any overt interest could have been. What Margaret did not know, and would not learn for many months, was that Thomas Renshaw had been selected and coached by Ronaldus across nearly 4 months of preparation, drawn from a pool of candidates chosen specifically for their genuine, verifiable connection to a real historical Renshaw family, a family that had, in fact, existed, though not in any relation to Margaret's father, the link between the two entirely fabricated through documents forged and planted years in advance in archives Julian had learned to quietly access and alter. Thomas's own vineyard, modest but genuinely productive across 11 years of real labor, gave him a plausible, verifiable life history that made his role considerably more convincing than an invented background ever could have. "I grew up hearing fragments about Grandpa Renshaw's bitterness," Thomas would later tell investigators. "When Bernard first approached me, years ago, and explained who Desmond Fane actually was and what his money had been built on, it felt like finally understanding a wound my whole family had carried without a name for it." "He's remarkable," Margaret told Zoe after their 3rd meeting. "Not at all what I expected. No interest in my money whatsoever, as far as I can tell." Zoe, listening to her client's evident, cautious delight, felt a small, persistent unease she couldn't yet fully articulate, a professional instinct, honed across 15 years of estate law, that the speed and completeness of Thomas Renshaw's apparent disinterest in Margaret's wealth felt, itself, like precisely the kind of performance a genuinely disinterested relative would never need to so carefully maintain. Zoe had built her considerable reputation in Adelaide on a specific principle she often repeated to junior colleagues, that a barrister's duty to a client extends beyond simply executing their instructions, toward actively protecting them from decisions made under incomplete information, however uncomfortable that protection sometimes proves with strong-willed clients. "Margaret is not an easy woman to caution," Zoe admitted to her junior colleague, Adiz Nwosu, in those early weeks. She has built 60 years of success on trusting her own judgment. Telling a woman like that gently that her judgment might currently be compromised by a very sophisticated manipulation requires a particular kind of tact I'm still working out how to deploy. Quietly, without informing Margaret, Zoe began her own independent verification of Julian Cross's research, assisted by a diligent research assistant named Priya Osei. Every individual document Julian presented checked out under scrutiny, genuine historical records, correctly interpreted. And yet something about the overall narrative's construction felt, to Zoe's practiced eye, too complete, too conveniently free of the ordinary gaps and inconsistencies real family history almost always contains. Her breakthrough came almost by accident, cross-referencing a cemetery record Julian had cited to establish an intermediate generation's death, a woman named Agnes Renshaw, supposedly buried in a small Tasmanian cemetery in 1962. When Zoe finally arranged for a colleague to physically verify the grave, it belonged to someone else entirely, a schoolteacher named Beatrice Coyle, no relation to any Renshaw at all. Priya spent nearly 3 weeks cross-referencing 40 different cemetery records before finding the actual headstone. I remember sitting in that archive reading room feeling a very specific kind of cold settle over me, she later told investigators, because up until that exact moment I'd assumed we were maybe looking at an unusually persuasive fraud. Once I found that headstone, I understood we were looking at something considerably more calculated. Either Julian made an extraordinary, uncharacteristic research error, Zoe told Priya, staring at the photographs from the actual cemetery, or someone constructed an entire fictional person and planted false records suggesting she once existed. Given how meticulous everything else about his work has been, I don't believe this is an error. It was, in fact, a signature technique, one Aaron Wu's later investigation would find repeated across at least 5 of the 8 earlier cases, a plausible, hard-to-verify intermediate ancestor, anchored to a real but misattributed grave, betting correctly that almost nobody checking their family history would ever physically travel to verify a headstone. It's clever, Aaron would later say, precisely because it exploits exactly the kind of verification gap an ordinary, trusting person would never think to close. Beatrice Coyle's own descendants, contacted much later by Aaron's team, found the whole business faintly surreal. It's a peculiar thing, being told your great-grandmother's grave was used as a prop in someone else's elaborate crime, her great-grandson Patrick Coyle told a local paper. Beatrice was just an ordinary woman, a schoolteacher. I suppose there's something almost fitting about a forgotten grave being the thread that unraveled something this significant. Margaret, informed carefully of the discrepancy without yet knowing the full scope of the pattern behind it, reacted with the same clear-headed practicality that had built her fortune. Then Thomas Renshaw is either being deceived himself, or he's part of whatever this actually is, she said. I want to know which before I sign anything further, and I want you to find out carefully, Zoe, because if I'm wrong about him, I would like to at least understand exactly how wrong I've been. Zoe herself never forgot how it felt to sit with that single, cold discovery, alone at her desk long after Priya had gone home for the evening, turning the cemetery photographs over in her hands the same way Margaret had once turned over the photograph of the stranger outside the weatherboard house. She was not yet thinking about 8 deaths, or a Melbourne trust, or a solicitor named Bernard Voss who did not yet have a name in her mind at all. She was thinking only that a woman she liked and admired, a woman who trusted her own judgment more thoroughly than almost anyone Zoe had ever represented, had been quietly and expertly lied to by a man whose entire professional reputation rested on his supposed incorruptibility. It was not yet fear. It was, she would say later, something closer to the particular, disorienting vertigo of realizing that a structure you had assumed was solid ground was, in fact, built over open air. Zoe's unease sent her, over the following month, into research well outside her ordinary professional scope, a systematic hunt through Australian probate records for other cases involving Julian Cross's consultancy. What she found, assembled painstakingly across public filings in 4 different states, left her, by her own later admission, genuinely frightened for her client's life. 8 elderly Australians, each with no close surviving family, each having engaged Julian Cross, each having altered their will to include a newly discovered relative his research had introduced, and each one dead, of causes ruled natural or accidental, within 18 months of that alteration. Among them was a Melbourne widower named Harold Bissett, whose estranged nephew Colin had once reported his own suspicions to local police, only to have the inquiry closed within a fortnight for want of any formal evidence. I remember him calling me, absolutely delighted about this cousin he'd never known existed, Colin later told Aaron Wu. I never stopped wondering, in the years since, whether that heart attack had really been quite as natural as everyone assured me it was. Every one of the 8 victims, Aaron would later reflect, had someone who half suspected something was wrong, suspicions that institutions, reasonably enough on their own terms, had filed away each time as an aggrieved relative's understandable jealousy. That's not really a failure of any individual investigator, Aaron said. It's a demonstration of exactly how well this scheme was built to exploit the ordinary skepticism institutions bring to unverified family complaints. A freelance journalist named Petra Sohn had, in fact, sensed a connection between 2 of the deaths a year before Zoe's research began, but had lacked the financial and legal expertise to prove it, and her editor had declined to fund a story built on what looked like thin coincidence. 8 deaths, Aaron, Zoe said, the day she finally telephoned Detective Aaron Wu of Victoria Police's Financial and Cybercrime Division, bypassing South Australian Police entirely on the recommendation of a colleague who knew Wu's reputation for exactly this kind of complex, cross-jurisdictional case. Aaron reviewed her meticulously assembled dossier across a single tense evening and recognized immediately the particular danger of what she'd found, a pattern invisible precisely because it had been engineered to look like nothing more than 8 unrelated, ordinary tragedies among Australia's elderly wealthy. This isn't opportunistic, he told his superintendent, Detective Inspector Marion Bly, requesting authorization for a full multi-state investigation. Bly, aware of the resources such coordination would consume, weighed the decision carefully until Aaron reframed it for her plainly. I told her that if I was wrong, this would be an expensive, embarrassing failure, he recalled. I also told her that if I was right, and we did nothing, an 82-year-old woman with no living close family was very likely to become the 9th documented death in a pattern we already had more than enough evidence to take seriously. Bly later put her own reasoning simply. Being wrong and cautious meant an expensive administrative embarrassment. Being right and cautious meant Margaret Fane died while we deliberated. A university biostatistician, Dr. Farah Hassan, calculated the odds of 8 such deaths occurring by pure chance and found them vanishingly small, a figure that proved decisive in persuading 4 separate state coronial offices, each cautious about reopening long-settled findings, to formally reopen the cases. It was a sympathetic Tasmanian coroner, persuaded by Aaron's documentation of the fabricated Renshaw grave, who broke the logjam first. The others followed within a fortnight. Zoe's continued digging turned up a second, even more telling pattern. An unusual phrase, in recognition of family owed, buried in differently worded clauses in 7 of the 8 altered wills, always attached to the bequest benefiting the newly discovered relative. It's not standard legal language, she told Aaron. I've practiced estate law 15 years and never seen that phrasing anywhere I didn't draft myself. It reads almost like a signature. A forensic document examiner, Dr. Sunita Rao, later confirmed under formal analysis that the same underlying drafting hand, the same sentence rhythm, the same structural habits, ran beneath all 8 documents, however different the 8 solicitors who had actually typed them. Each of those solicitors, once interviewed, turned out to be entirely innocent. Each had simply incorporated supplementary notes their client's own genealogist had supplied, trusting paperwork built, deliberately, to look exactly as legitimate as it appeared. 8 separate, entirely competent solicitors, Aaron told Zoe, each one doing their job correctly, and each one still became an unknowing accomplice simply by trusting documentation that looked exactly as legitimate as it was designed to look. Parallel to all this, Zoe's research into Desmond Fane's own history uncovered a chapter of Margaret's family that Margaret herself had never known. In the early 1960s, Desmond had aggressively acquired several rural properties across South Australia and Tasmania, leaving at least 4 families financially ruined, 2 of them driven entirely from land their families had worked for generations. One of those families had been named Renshaw, not the same Renshaw line Julian's fabricated genealogy claimed, but a real, historically documented family whose modest Tasmanian farm Desmond had taken through pressure tactics in 1961, leaving them destitute within 2 years. "I never knew any of this," Margaret said, reading the assembled record with visible, genuine distress. "My father was a hard man in business. I always knew that. I never imagined he'd built any part of his fortune on other families' ruin." Zoe's research eventually identified all 4 ruined families: the Renshaws of Tasmania, the Culhanes of the Adelaide Hills, whose dairy farm Desmond took through a disputed foreclosure in 1963, the Mercers of regional Victoria, driven from a wool property worked for 3 generations, and the Okafors, a family of Adelaide market gardeners displaced through methods a later informal parliamentary inquiry had called commercially aggressive to a degree bordering on exploitation. None of the 4 families had ever had any lawful path to recover what they'd lost. The statute of limitations had closed that door long before anyone thought to open it. "That's precisely the vulnerability someone identified," Zoe told Margaret, "and built an entire conspiracy around: genuine, unaddressed historical injury, festering for decades with absolutely no legitimate outlet." Aaron, meanwhile, found himself navigating a genuinely daunting logistical challenge entirely separate from the puzzle of Julian Cross himself. 8 deaths, ruled natural or accidental by 4 different state coronial systems, each requiring formal reopening through entirely separate legal processes before any unified prosecution could even begin to take shape. He spent nearly 3 weeks almost entirely on jurisdictional paperwork, drafting careful, evidence-dense briefs for each state's relevant authorities, aware throughout that every week of bureaucratic delay left Margaret Fane, still very much alive and still very much inside the ongoing scheme, increasingly vulnerable. "The hardest part wasn't finding the pattern," he told a colleague. "Zoe had essentially handed us the pattern already assembled. The hardest part was convincing 4 different offices, each operating under its own procedures and its own institutional caution, that this justified the very significant resources reopening 8 cases simultaneously would require. It was unglamorous, patient, entirely unheroic work, the kind that rarely makes it into the retelling of a case like this one, and yet Zoe would later insist it had proven every bit as essential to the investigation's eventual success as any single piece of forensic evidence Aaron's team subsequently uncovered. 10 weeks into the investigation, Aaron's team executed coordinated search warrants against Julian Cross's Adelaide office and his private residence, moving simultaneously to prevent any chance of evidence destruction. The search of his home produced a detail that unsettled even the officers who found it: a private study containing detailed files on each of his 8 previous clients, organized less like professional records and more, In the words of the lead search officer, Constable Amaracito, like the kind of documentation a collector might keep of individually prized specimens. Personal notes on each victim's vulnerabilities and what specific approach had worked best in gaining their trust, written with something closer to quiet pride than professional distance. There was nothing overtly incriminating in any single document, taken alone, Cito said. What troubled me was the tone. But it was the financial records that reframed the entire case. Julian's consultancy, though extraordinarily profitable, retained only a modest fraction of each estate's eventual value. The overwhelming majority moved on, through a dense chain of trusts and holding companies, toward a destination Aaron's forensic accountants would spend weeks tracing. He's not the primary beneficiary, Aaron told Zoe. He's being paid well, certainly, but the real money is moving somewhere else, through a structure I don't think Julian built himself. I think he believes he's running this operation. I'm increasingly convinced he's being run. Leading that forensic effort, a meticulous analyst named Deepak Fernandez spent nearly 6 weeks unwinding what he called the most deliberately obscured financial architecture I've encountered outside large-scale organized crime. Multiple jurisdictions, deliberately mismatched reporting thresholds, trusts nested inside trusts, all timed specifically to avoid triggering regulatory review. His team found the crucial trust almost by accident, tracing a routine tax filing anomaly that, cross-referenced against the timing of each of the 8 prior estate distributions, revealed a pattern of coordinated movement Deepak called invisible unless you already know exactly what you're looking for, and blindingly obvious the moment you do. The trail converged on a single coordinating trust registered in Melbourne, whose beneficiary structure, once finally obtained by court order, read almost like a confession, 4 family names, each connected to one of Desmond Fane's historical acquisitions, receiving disbursements timed precisely to follow each of the 8 prior deaths by a consistent, calculated interval. Deepak himself found the discovery almost dizzying in how quickly it reorganized everything the investigation thought it understood. Once we had the trust identified, everything else fell into place remarkably quickly, he told Aaron. The beneficiary structure read almost like a confession in itself. It's not simple theft, Aaron told Zoe and Margaret together, once the shape of it finally became clear. It's redistribution, deliberately targeted. Julian's genealogical skill made him the perfect operational tool, genuinely brilliant at constructing convincing family narratives, and I now believe genuinely unaware of the full scope of who was actually directing his work. Margaret absorbed this with the stillness of a woman confronting, for the second time in as many months, an entirely different understanding of her own family. So Thomas Renshaw, she said slowly, isn't simply a coached actor. He's a genuine descendant of a family my father actually ruined, recruited into a scheme built to finally take something back. The name behind the Melbourne Trust would not surface for weeks yet. Aaron had sensed him long before he could see him. You develop an instinct for when you're dealing with an opportunist and when you're dealing with an architect, he told Zoe during one of their frequent case review sessions. Julian felt like an opportunist from very early, brilliant at his craft, but reactive. Someone else built the 9-year patience, the specific targeting of Desmond Fane's history, that takes a mind that thinks in decades, not months. One family Bernard had approached and failed to recruit gave Aaron's team a rare view from the outside. Nomvula Okafor, great-granddaughter of the ruined Adelaide market gardeners, had met Bernard years earlier and initially found him merely eccentric. Historical restitution, he called it, she told Aaron. It sounded almost noble, put that way. It was only when he started explaining the mechanics, the genealogist, the coached introduction, the eventual will, that I understood we weren't talking about anything legitimate. I told him I wanted no part of it, and he was gracious about my refusal, disturbingly so. I had no idea, Until your investigation contacted me, that 7 other families had said yes. Elsewhere, the coaching itself came into focus. A former colleague of Ronaldo's, having grown suspicious of her career, described overhearing part of a coaching session by accident, when walking someone through specific questions to expect exactly how much interest to show in a target's wealth, which was to say almost none, because too much interest was the fastest way to trigger suspicion. One of Wren's coached beneficiaries, a soft-spoken accountant named Felicity Marsh, who had inherited from an Adelaide Hills grazier named Reginald Coyne 2 years before Margaret's case began, later gave Aaron one of the investigation's most wrenching accounts. I told myself the whole time that Reginald was simply a lonely old man who genuinely wanted to leave something to family, she said, her composure cracking across the interview. It was only after he died, of what I was told was a stroke, entirely natural, that a small, persistent doubt started working at me. I did not let myself examine that doubt properly for 2 more years, because examining it properly would have meant admitting what I'd actually been part of. Reginald's own housekeeper, Bridget Farrelly, had watched the courtship unfold at close range and believed, at the time, she was witnessing something wonderful happen to a lonely old man. I've had to reconsider almost every memory I have of that final year, she told Aaron, wondering which parts were genuine warmth and which parts were simply very, very good technique. It was during this tense stretch that Margaret, unable to sleep after being briefed on the search's findings, rang Zoe near midnight. I keep thinking about that photograph arriving in my post office box, she said. I thought I was being offered a gift. I understand now I was being measured, the way Julian measured all 8 of the others, for exactly how completely my own loneliness could be exploited. I am angrier about that than I am frightened, though I understand I'm entitled to feel both. It was in this same conversation that Margaret first raised, tentatively, an idea that would come to define the case's conclusion. Rather than simply protecting herself, she wanted to use her own vulnerability deliberately as bait. Margaret kept, throughout this period, a private habit she disclosed to almost no one, a small notebook in which she recorded her evolving thoughts about her father, her collection, and the strange, unwelcome inheritance of historical guilt the case had forced upon her, entries she later described to Zoe as the only place I allowed myself to be less composed than I needed to appear to everyone else. Near the case's conclusion, she read one of those entries aloud. I wrote that my father built something beautiful on a foundation he never let me see clearly, she said. I wrote that I did not choose that foundation, but that choosing what to do once I finally saw it clearly was entirely mine to decide, and that I intended to decide it honestly rather than defensively. Zoe, hearing it, was struck by how precisely it captured the moral clarity Margaret would go on to bring to her public reckoning with her father's legacy, a private, unglamorous process of reflection that had, in the end, produced considerably more courage than any of the investigation's dramatic machinery alone could ever have accounted for. Once the full architecture of the conspiracy became clear, Margaret made a decision that surprised both Zoe and Aaron considerably. Rather than severing contact with Thomas Renshaw and Julian Cross and quietly protecting her estate, she wanted to proceed with her 9th will exactly as planned, but altered, in careful consultation with Zoe and Aaron, to expose the conspiracy rather than simply survive it. I understand what my father did to that family, she told Aaron, with the same formidable clarity that had built her considerable life. I am not interested in simply protecting my own estate while pretending that history doesn't exist. I would like to structure this will so that it forces every person involved in this conspiracy, Julian, Wren, whoever sits behind that Melbourne trust, to reveal themselves through their own greed, competing against each other for a bequest structured to turn their cooperation into rivalry the moment my death makes the money real. Zoe drafted it with immense care, aware of a specific legal danger, Any structure that looked deliberately engineered to entrap could later be challenged as unlawful inducement and unravel the whole prosecution. I had to draft something that reflected Margaret's own genuine, legitimate testamentary wishes, Zoe explained, rather than a document designed purely as investigative bait. Every clause needed to survive scrutiny as an authentic expression of an elderly woman's considered wishes, not as evidence manufactured by police. What she eventually produced, after consulting extensively with senior counsel, divided the bulk of Margaret's estate not into a single bequest to Thomas, but into a complex, staggered structure requiring multiple parties, descendants unknowingly of all 4 ruined families, to first cooperate and, later, to compete. "It's an extraordinary risk," Zoe warned Margaret. "If this goes wrong, you could be signing your own death warrant rather than exposing a conspiracy." Margaret's answer carried the unshakable resolve of a woman who had decided, at 82, that some risks were worth taking regardless of cost. "I've spent 6 decades building a legacy on money I've just learned was never entirely clean," she said. "I would rather risk everything exposing that truth than die peacefully, having simply let it continue unexamined." Zoe herself later admitted the drafting weeks were the hardest of her career. "I drafted a document I genuinely believed might get my own client killed," she said. "Every night during that period, I found myself running through the structure again, looking for some flaw." Her husband, Daniel, recalled it as the only time in their marriage he'd seen her genuinely lose sleep over a case, pacing their kitchen testing the will's resilience against every conceivable challenge. "She told me once that drafting that will felt less like practicing law and more like building a trap," he said, and that the hardest part was accepting that the bait inside the trap was a woman she'd come to genuinely care about. Around Margaret's Adelaide Hills property, a covert protection detail settled in for the duration, coordinated by a sergeant named Bianca Reyes. We rotated surveillance teams constantly, varied our vehicles and positions, did everything we could to make sure nobody watching that property long-term would notice a pattern, Reyes reported. "The hardest part wasn't the surveillance itself, it was Margaret. She's a formidable woman, and formidable women don't always appreciate being told to alter their daily routines for their own protection. Margaret tolerated the intrusion into her routine with visible irritation. I understood the necessity intellectually, and I resented it considerably in practice," she said later. "I've spent 8 decades making my own decisions about my own safety and being quietly managed by well-meaning young officers, however necessary, chafed against nearly everything about how I prefer to live." Her final direct conversation with Thomas Renshaw, conducted at Aaron's request so she could maintain apparent normalcy while the case developed, tested her composure more than any other moment in the investigation. "I had to sit across from a man I now understood was involved, at some level, in a scheme that had already killed 8 people, and behave as though I still believed him simply a newly discovered cousin," she told Zoe afterward, her hands trembling for the first time since the case began. The will was formally executed, and it produced exactly the fracture Margaret had gambled it would. Within weeks, surveillance established that Thomas Renshaw had begun quietly contacting the other named beneficiaries, descendants. Aaron's team quickly confirmed, of the 3 other ruined families the conspiracy had been compensating across its 9 years. The conspiracy's cohesion, built for a decade on the shared conviction that its members were correcting historical injustice rather than committing fraud and murder, collapsed almost as soon as Margaret's structure made clear that continued cooperation would yield each family considerably less than a more aggressive, unilateral claim might secure. Julian Cross, questioned separately once Aaron's team moved to formal arrests, gave up the identity of the conspiracy's true architect, a Melbourne solicitor named Bernard Voss, distantly connected himself to one of the 4 ruined families, who had spent over a decade quietly recruiting descendants of Desmond Fane's other historical victims. I believed, genuinely, that I was helping people reclaim something owed to them, Julian told Aaron, in an interview that revealed, for the first time, something close to the psychopathic detachment Zoe had long suspected beneath his warmth. I did not concern myself particularly with the deaths. Elderly people die. I simply ensured the timing served the structure. I understand you find that troubling. I have never found it troubling myself, which I suspect is precisely the quality that made me useful to Bernard in the first place. Bernard Voss's arrest, executed at his Melbourne office, unfolded with an unnerving composure. He simply set down his pen, folded his hands, and asked, with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, exactly which piece of evidence had finally identified him. I always assumed there would be a specific point of failure eventually, he told the arresting officers, before his solicitor arrived and ended the conversation. 9 years is a long time to run something this complex without any single mistake. I confess I'm curious which thread finally unraveled it. Aaron would later describe the exchange as one of the case's most unsettling details, a man facing multiple murder charges responding not with fear or denial, but with something closer to professional interest in the mechanics of his own downfall. In his own formal interview, Bernard offered no denial and no remorse, only a carefully rationalized worldview, refined across many years, in which he cast himself as a historical corrector rather than a murderer. The law offered these families nothing, he told Aaron, in the same composed, faintly professorial tone throughout. Statutes of limitation, courts uninterested in reopening 60-year-old land transactions regardless of how exploitative they were by any reasonable modern standard. I did not create that failure. I simply recognized it and built a mechanism to correct it that the formal system had proven incapable of providing. When Aaron pressed him on the 8 deaths directly, Bernard's composure never wavered. Regrettable, he said, but necessary to the structure's function. I am not going to pretend to a remorse I do not genuinely feel, Detective. I believe, and I expect I will continue to believe regardless of whatever sentence this process eventually produces, that I corrected something the law had spent 60 years failing to correct. Aaron, reviewing the two men's interviews side by side once both were finally in custody, found something quietly unsettling in how alike Julian and Bernard sounded, for all their apparent differences. The same composed, faintly academic distance, the same careful absence of anything resembling fear. It occurred to him only later, turning the comparison over on the long drive back to Melbourne, that Bernard had perhaps recognized something of himself in Julian from the very beginning and had chosen him for precisely that reason, not merely for his genealogical brilliance, but for a particular coolness of temperament that made him exactly the kind of instrument a patient architect could rely on never to flinch, never to hesitate, never to let a stray flicker of conscience jeopardize 9 years of careful work. The trial, held in Adelaide's Supreme Court and drawing national attention to the scale and sophistication of the conspiracy, produced convictions against Julian Cross, Aldis, and Bernard Voss on multiple counts of murder, fraud, and conspiracy, alongside lesser convictions against Thomas Renshaw and 2 other coached beneficiaries who successfully argued, with considerable public sympathy, that their participation had been shaped by genuine historical grievance and an incomplete understanding of the scheme's lethal methods. Margaret Fane testified for 2 days, describing both her father's historical conduct and her own deliberate decision to weaponize her 9th will against the very conspiracy targeting her, testimony many would later call the trial's most compelling and most morally complex moment. I do not forgive my father for what he did to those families, she told the court, in remarks widely reported across the country. I am not certain forgiveness is mine to offer, given that I was not the one harmed. I do believe, however, that meeting old injustice with new murder simply compounds the original wrong rather than correcting it, and it is that principle, more than any desire for self-preservation, that shaped every decision I made once I understood what was actually being done in my name. Bernard Voss received the trial's most severe sentence, life imprisonment without parole eligibility for 25 years, the court finding his role as architect and his cold calculation regarding the 8 previous deaths to represent culpability exceeding even Julian's operational participation. He received it with the same detached composure he'd carried throughout the trial, offering nothing beyond a single, measured nod, as though acknowledging the outcome of a calculation he had always understood carried some finite probability of ending exactly this way. Julian Cross, whose final formal interview had revealed a chilling, almost bored honesty about his own remorselessness. "You keep asking me whether I feel remorse, detective, as though the answer might change something about the charges I'm facing," he'd told Aaron. "I feel professional satisfaction at how completely my method worked for 9 years, against people considerably more suspicious and better resourced than 8 lonely elderly Australians. I do not feel the kind of remorse you are hoping to record for your files, and I am not going to manufacture it." Was convicted on the full weight of the murder and fraud charges brought against him. "I've interviewed genuinely remorseless people before," Aaron reflected afterward. "Most of them still perform some version of regret, out of habit if nothing else. Julian didn't even bother with the performance. I found that considerably more unsettling than any confession of guilt could have been." Reynolds, sentenced separately in recognition of a role the court accepted did not extend to knowledge of each victim's specific death, received 18 years with an 11-year non-parole period. Justice Miriam Okonkwo, delivering sentencing remarks that drew considerable subsequent legal commentary, noted that Wren's culpability, while grave, was meaningfully separate from that of her co-defendants on the specific question of the killings themselves. Wren herself, addressing the court briefly before sentencing, offered an account several observers found genuinely, if incompletely, reflective. "I built performances for people I never met, based on psychological profiles I was given, and I told myself for years that what happened afterward wasn't really my responsibility," she said. "I understand now that this distinction was always more comfortable for me than it was honest. I coached the deception that made each death profitable. I don't think I get to pretend that's meaningfully separate from the deaths themselves." Descendants of the 4 ruined families gave evidence during the trial that added real, uncomfortable weight to the case's moral shape. "My grandmother never stopped talking about that property," testified Eleanor Mercer, the family's eldest living descendant, in testimony that visibly moved several jurors. She died still angry about it. 40 years later, in a rented house in Bendigo she always said should have been a working property with her family's name on the gate. "I understand that anger doesn't excuse murder. I want to say that plainly. But when Bernard Voss first told my father what had actually happened to our family, my father wept. The first time in either of our lives anyone had acknowledged that our loss was real, and that someone with influence and resources thought it mattered enough to do something about it." It was testimony like Eleanor's, alongside similar accounts from Culhane and Okafor family representatives, that left the jury deliberating Bernard's case for 5 days, considerably longer than for his co-defendants, not over his factual guilt, which none of them doubted for a moment, but over how to hold 2 truths simultaneously. "We didn't doubt his factual guilt for a moment," one juror told a legal affairs podcast some months after the trial concluded, speaking anonymously per standard practice. "What took us 5 days was something harder to name, trying to hold both truths at once, that these families really had been wronged, genuinely and substantially, and that nothing about that historical wrong justified what Bernard Voss built in response to it." I think all 12 of us walked out of that deliberation room changed in some way by having to sit with that tension for as long as we did. The eventual verdict, convicting Bernard on all counts, arrived without any recommendation for leniency, though several jurors later expressed hope that the broader public conversation the case had generated might eventually produce some more legitimate mechanism for addressing exactly the kind of historical grievance that had, in this instance, curdled into murder. In the 2 years that followed, Margaret undertook a project that surprised even Zoe, working with historians and genealogists considerably more scrupulous than Julian Cross had ever been. She established a private foundation dedicated to identifying and providing legitimate, transparent restitution to families genuinely harmed by her father's historical business practices. We insisted on radical transparency from the outset, precisely because of how this all began, Margaret told the Foundation's inaugural annual report. Every claim is independently verified by researchers with no connection whatsoever to my estate. Every disbursement is a matter of public record. I wanted to build something that could never be mistaken, even by the most cynical observer, for a private, unaccountable mechanism of the kind that cost 8 people their lives. Speaking to a journalist at the Foundation's public launch, she put it even more plainly. I could have simply protected my estate and moved on, she said. I chose instead to actually do the thing this conspiracy pretended to be doing, properly and honestly, because I think that's the only response to discovering your family's fortune has a shadow side that actually means anything at all. Thomas Renshaw, having served a reduced sentence in recognition of his cooperation and his genuine lack of knowledge of the scheme's lethal methods, was among the Foundation's first recipients, a choice Margaret defended publicly despite considerable criticism, insisting his family's genuine historical grievance deserved acknowledgement regardless of the criminal means through which he'd first pursued it. Upon his release, Thomas wrote Margaret a long, careful letter of apology, which she kept framed discreetly in the same study where the original photograph had first arrived, a small, private reminder of exactly how far the case had traveled from its deceptively simple beginning. It was, in its own quiet way, an extraordinary thing to witness. The woman who had once sat frozen at her desk, staring at a stranger's face in a 50-year-old photograph and wondering what unease it stirred in her, now standing at the head of an entirely legitimate institution built to do honestly what a murderous conspiracy had once tried to do by deception. Bartholomew Reyes, her old auction house colleague, remarked once that Margaret in those years seemed, if anything, more herself than he had ever known her, not softened by what she'd survived, but sharpened by it, the same formidable clarity she had always brought to a difficult acquisition now turned toward the considerably harder work of an honest reckoning with her own family's history. She never fully forgave her father, and she said so plainly, more than once in public. But she came, gradually, to see the Foundation not as an act of forgiveness at all, but as something more useful than forgiveness, an act of repair, conducted in daylight, with her name attached to every page of it. The Foundation's first-year disbursements were modest in scale compared to the sheer weight of the historical harm they addressed, but Margaret described the process itself, in her final public interview on the subject, as the only genuinely satisfying outcome available to me, once I understood there was no way to simply undo what my father had done, or what Bernard Voss had subsequently built on top of it. Zoe Kallis, reflecting on the case years later at a legal conference examining unusual estate fraud, offered what she considered its most important lesson. We tend to think of inheritance fraud as simple greed, she said. This case taught me something more complicated, that historical injustice, left unaddressed for long enough, creates exactly the kind of grievance a sufficiently patient, sufficiently ruthless architect can weaponize into something considerably darker than the original wrong. Margaret Fane's real achievement wasn't surviving her 9th will. It was recognizing that the only way to actually close that wound was to address it honestly, rather than simply defending herself against yet another attempt to exploit it. Aaron Wu, invited to the same conference, closed his own remarks with an observation he had carried since the trial's conclusion. "Every fraud case teaches you something about what people are actually hungry for," he said. "Most of the time it's simple enough: money, status, security. This case taught me that the hungriest, most exploitable feeling of all might just be the wish to belong to someone." Julian Cross understood that better than almost anyone I've ever investigated, and he built an entire criminal career on it. I'd like to think Margaret Fane's response to him, choosing honest connection over comfortable denial, even at genuine risk to herself, is the better lesson to actually take from all of this. And there ends the ninth will, a story about the debts a family can carry without ever knowing it, and about one formidable woman who decided that the only honest answer to inheritance built on harm was to finally, transparently, make it right. Thank you for spending time with Emavira Audiobooks channel.